There's a moment in the 1988 film Caddyshack II. It happens about 1 minute and 7 seconds into the movie. Out of the ground pops a mechanical puppet gopher, supposedly the same gopher from the original, successful Caddyshack, released 8 years earlier, but it looks suspiciously different physically, now gyrates in a slightly disturbing manner and, for some inexplicable reason, has been given one of the most off-putting speaking voices this side of Jar Jar Binks. And it is at this very moment, little more than a minute into what was Warner Brothers' big comedy release of the summer of '88, that you realise this entire movie and franchise is absolutely cooked. In Caddyshack 2, as with any number of other bad sequels, it soon becomes clear that this early warning sign is only the tip of the iceberg. Not all sequels are disasters, of course. When done well, occasionally, sequels have been truly brilliant. But that is often not the case. Financially, artistically, or both, they can invariably end up being totally bankrupt. I've always been fascinated by the way film studios attempt to follow up hit movies, and how it so often becomes a complete disaster. So I created the series Sequelpalooza to explore the history of it one film series at a time. This video captures the first 3 episodes in one place, with a few culture slice Easter eggs dotted throughout for good measure. So grab a comfy seat and some popcorn, sit back, relax, and enjoy the saga so far in the very first Sequelpalooza Megamix. And we're going to begin with a shining beacon of 80s fantasy cinema and the franchise it spawned of not one but 2 truly legendary examples from the movie sequel Hall of Shame. Have you ever watched a movie and thought, this is great, can't wait for the sequel? And then when you actually saw the sequel, you said to yourself, man, they really should have left this alone after 1? Well then this is the show for you. Welcome to Sequelpalooza.
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 Sequel.
The series that takes a hit movie, asks what happened next, and discovers that it's usually a complete and utter mess. In each episode, we'll be telling the story of a different film series from across the decades. And for the first ever edition, we're taking a look at one of the most memorable films of the 1980s. A timeless classic fantasy film which still resonates to this day. And the franchise of sequels that followed in its wake. The NeverEnding Story is a stone cold banger. Not just another cookie cutter Hollywood movie off the production line. In fact, Hollywood had very little to do with its production at all. As the NeverEnding Story did attempt to court the American market more in the 1990s, however, things perhaps took one of the steepest declines we will ever cover in this series. But where did it all go wrong? How rough did things get? And could anything have been done to stop the crash?
Mr. Simpson, this is the most blatant case of fraudulent advertising since my suit against the film The NeverEnding Story.
The NeverEnding Story ends in flames. This is Sequelpalooza. Hi, Culture Slice here. We're in Munich, Germany, and the year is 1984, and we are having it large in one of the city's many discotheques. Sorry, got a bit carried away remembering my days as a presenter on European clubbing TV for a second. Anyway, as I was saying, it is spring 1984, and the people of Munich are awaiting the release of what was, at this stage, the most expensive film ever made outside of America or the Soviet Union. It was that most rare of cinematic moments, a German international blockbuster for the whole family. Because yes, The NeverEnding Story is very much a German movie, adapted from one of the country's most iconic books of the era and produced by a German production company. At this point, we were still 5 years away from the fall of the Berlin Wall and German reunification. But in West Germany at least, the release of a movie version of The NeverEnding Story was becoming a huge cultural moment. The film would be an adaptation of Michael Ende's novel, Die unendliche Geschichte, aka The NeverEnding Story. A book which, upon its release in 1979, had topped the German bestsellers list for 113 consecutive weeks. One person who was a fan was director Wolfgang Petersen, who by the early 1980s had become Germany's hottest director after his submarine war film Das Boot grossed over $84 million and ended up being nominated for 6 Oscars, including Best Director for Petersen himself. After spending 3 years underwater, the director wanted a complete change of pace and to make a film that his young son could actually watch. As fate would have it, The NeverEnding Story was scheduled to be made at Munich's Bavaria Studios and was in urgent need of a director, after original director Helmut Diel had decided the project was too much for him, and it was a project which captured not just his own, but the nation's imagination. The NeverEnding Story was a true event and something that we didn't have in Germany for a long time, that millions and millions of people, especially kids, were reading. It was big news in Germany. The film would cover the first half of the book, leaving open a clear opportunity for a sequel, and maybe even a series of movies. The NeverEnding Story told the, story of Bastian, a young boy grieving the loss of his mother and dealing with bullies making his life even more difficult. When he steals a book, The NeverEnding Story, from a bookstore he is hiding from his bullies in, Bastian's imagination enters the magical world of Fantasia, which is slowly being devoured by an invisible dark force known as the Nothing. With Fantasia's childlike empress becoming increasingly ill, the kid warrior Atreyu sets off on a quest to find a cure and save Fantasia, as Bastian's own world becomes more and more entangled with the one he is reading in the book. Being largely set in Fantasia, altered slightly from its name of Fantastica in the book, allows for the introduction of numerous new weird and wonderful characters, including Falcor the Luck Dragon. Man, what I would have given to have a luck dragon when I was a kid. Anyway, the production was a notoriously difficult one. Writer Ender, who sold the rights to producers Dieter Giesler and Bernd Eichinger and initially helped Petersen with the screenplay, would eventually become so furious with the treatment of his work that he sued the makers to try to shut production down and later demanded his name be removed from the finished film. The shoot just slightly ran late. Originally scheduled for 3 months, it would instead go on for a whole year. The largely handmade effects and characters made progress painstakingly slow. The film went massively over budget. It ended up being made for 60 million Deutschmarks, or $27 million, a huge amount in Germany at the time. The NeverEnding Story didn't feature any stars' names on the poster, with the inexperienced likes of Tammy Stronach as the childlike empress and Barrett Oliver as Bastian, though Noah Hathaway, who played Atreyu, had been in Battlestar Galactica. The young stars were worked hard, sometimes requiring 40 takes per scene, and Hathaway even nearly lost an eye when the animatronic Wolf Gamork slashed his face for real. But the sense of wonder in the finished product was undeniable. The combination of real life and model sets, animatronics and blue screen effects created an entirely believable world. The fact that Petersen was a surprising choice for a movie that would largely be aimed at kids actually played into the NeverEnding Story's favour. There were moments of legitimate terror and also real emotional impact. It captures the value and power of a kid's imagination as well as any film I could name. Seeing the movie as an adult, you of course draw different meanings. The Nothing, the all-consuming, unstoppable villain of the piece, strikes me as a metaphor for depression and feels strangely beautiful because of it. This is a kids' movie that tackles big themes and features one of the most harrowing losses of an animal cinema will ever see. Truly, Atreyu's horse Artax being consumed by the swamp of sadness is burnt into my brain for life. It is one of the most heartbreaking scenes committed to film across the entire decade. There are bleak moments for a family film, but it's that very light and shade that is part of what makes it so special. It seems like for many fans of the book, this is a film that works without being a completely devoted adaptation, which is not in itself a problem, I guess, even if devotees of Ender's work might disagree. Adapting well-loved source material to the big screen is not straightforward, and some liberties will inevitably often need to be made to create a cohesive film vision. A book can be great, and a movie inspired by that book can also be great at the same time, even if it might not religiously follow every element of the text. Those two things don't have to be mutually exclusive, but I get being a hardcore fan might give someone a different perspective. Or for Michael Ender, sent over the edge by Peterson's alterations, not least bringing proceedings back to the real world for the finale, didn't agree. He declared that it was a gigantic melodrama of kitsch, commerce, plush and plastic. Wow, if he thought the first one was bad, he must have absolutely hit the roof when he saw the sequels. Anyway, The NeverEnding Story was released in Germany on April 6, 1984, and perhaps unsurprisingly, performed incredibly well, raking in $20 million, a feat rarely seen by a German-made film. Prior to the US release, Steven Spielberg helped Peterson re-edit the movie for the American audience, and truly legendary producer Giorgio Moroder delivered the theme song, sung by Limahl of 80s pop hitmakers Kajagoogoo. It's one of the most memorable from an era of entirely memorable movie theme songs. The film is backed by a beautiful score from Klaus Doldinger, a regular collaborator for Peterson's work. Reviews at the time for the movie were pretty mixed. Roger Ebert loved it, for example, but his TV partner Gene Siskel most definitely did not.
NeverEnding Story is okay, I guess, in that it is innocent fun, but personally I didn't care for it. I found it much too long. The art direction makes the film look cheap, as I said, and the special effects didn't dazzle this 38-year-old. The little boy reading the book, he was okay as a character, but the young warrior boy, a dullard. I know the film wasn't made for people my age. I still didn't care for it.
I enjoyed this movie. The special effects didn't look cheesy to me. They had a lot of invention to them.
Yeah.
The whole romantic idea of this little kid's imagination all appealed to me.
Despite critical circles not universally praising the film, Warner Brothers must have been hopeful that the film could catch fire at the box office when it made its debut in American cinemas a few months later. In the end, the movie disappointed at US cinemas in the summer of '84, taking just $21.3 million. But if you look at the sheer insane standard of the films in the top 10 of the first week of its American release, maybe the congested schedule makes its underperformance a bit more understandable. I've said it before, and I'll say it again, the 1980s was a truly glorious time for film fans. As it opened in more and more territories over the next year though, the rest of the world took the NeverEnding Story into their hearts. Global box office exceeded $100 million, and in the years that followed, the film would prove a success in the home video and TV markets. Even if it has been labelled as goofy and cheesy in some quarters, fans of the film have become more passionate by the year, and the NeverEnding Story has endured an undeniable magic with those of a certain generation, like me. It was one of the first videos I ever asked my parents to watch. Watching it again, I thought to myself, if only more films like this were released today. Back in the mid-80s, the second half of the book that inspired the NeverEnding Story film was ready to be made into a successful follow-up. In theory, a sequel did seem inevitable, whether Michael Ender liked it or not. I mean, this was the NeverEnding Story after all. But could lightning possibly strike twice for Germany's biggest 80s blockbuster? Or were the franchise and its viewers heading towards the swamp of sadness?
Bastian made many other wishes and had many other amazing adventures. before he finally returned to the ordinary world. But that's another story.
The reality is that making sequels is hard. For every success, there are countless failures. Any number of issues can arise when attempting to get the band back together, and the NeverEnding Story 2 would end up facing most of them. The original plan had been to make a sequel fairly rapidly, but Michael Ender's continued disdain for the film which had been made from his work rumbled on beyond the first film's success, and litigation continued. The author demanded creative input across all future film iterations of his work. Though Ender lost in court, he did eventually agree to a second film being made. But this all took time, and wasted time for a sequel can be a major problem. The NeverEnding Story had dropped in 1984, and it was now 1989, 5 years later, and the first stages of production were only just able to begin. The film would not see the light of day until late 1990 in Germany, and it wouldn't be until 1991 that it would arrive at US cinemas. The movie landscape was entirely different at this point. The first NeverEnding Story had landed at a time when Hollywood was in the middle of a fantasy film bonanza, a seemingly endless stream of sorcery and magical lands. The only problem was, they weren't cheap to do well, and, even if some are remembered fondly today, a lot of those movies bombed at the box office. By the end of the 1980s, that moment had well and truly passed. Director Wolfgang Petersen had finally made his move to Los Angeles after the first film had wrapped, and would not return to Fantasia. For his second film in a row, he had stepped in to replace the original director on a troubled project, this time the sci-fi movie Enemy Mine, which flatlined completely in theatres upon release. For the NeverEnding Story 2, the producers decided to only bring in a director later in the process, after Karen Howard's screenplay had been completed, and only when production was ready to begin. This would be Howard's first ever film screenplay. The director they chose was the Scottish-born Australian George T. Miller, not to be confused with the other Australian director George Miller, who has made all the Mad Max films and Babe. Sadly, they weren't able to secure him. After delays upon delays, the young actors who had been established in the first film were now all way too old to reprise their roles. Replacing some of the cast from the first film is dodgy ground for a sequel, but to replace essentially all of them? Things were looking tough for the NeverEnding Story 2 from the jump. So let's break it down. New director drafted in at the last minute, new screenwriter with little to no experience, more than half a decade after the first film's release, completely new lead cast, and made years after the fantasy film trend of the 80s had ended. But they did have the characters of Fantasia, the data which showed a strong second life in home viewing, and that killer theme tune. Although, even that hadn't been in the charts for more than half a decade, and the musical zeitgeist had massively shifted as well. Plus, in the second one, it's performed by someone called Joe Milner, who, as far as Discogs can tell me, hasn't ever released anything that is not related to the NeverEnding Story 2. Milner also provides vocals for Dreams We Dream, a new theme song for the second part and another Giorgio Moroder number. It's not a patch on the theme from the first film. The majority of the score for part 2 comes from Robert Falk, who does a decent enough job, but his masterpiece has, and always will remain, yes, the Police Academy theme. What a banger that is. Anyway, by the time production began in earnest, any sense of momentum had been completely lost. When it came down to the cast, the only actor returning from the first film was Thomas Hill, the bookshop owner, so the producers had their work cut out. The part of Bastian went to Jonathan Brandis, Kenny Morrison played Atreyu, and Alexandra Jones became the childlike empress. Zaida, the evil sorceress of the piece, was played by Carissa Burt. Seemingly fearful of similar delays to the first film, and perhaps working under the guidelines of returning producer Dieter Giesler, director Miller ensured that the film was shot at a fast pace, only taking 4 months for this one rather than the whole year it took for part 1. and there is a sense of things being rushed in the final film, even if it took so many years after Part 1 to see the light of day. The NeverEnding Story 2 follows Bastian as he embarks upon a journey into Fantasia, when he heeds the call of the childlike Empress. An invisible force has trapped the childlike Empress in her castle and threatens Fantasia's existence. Again, this is the work of Zaida, who then attempts to erase all of Bastian's memories. You see, all that can save the childlike Empress and Fantasia itself are the wishes of Bastian, though every time he uses one, he also loses a memory from his own life. Zaida and her cronies, including Nimbly, a bizarre-looking and pretty annoying bird creature thing, attempt to fool Bastian into using them up before he can save the magical land, or something. The reviews were, yeah, not great, though some saw a bit of merit for younger viewers. Most saw it for what it was, an inferior follow-up, a film which had been made with great effort and no charm, with little going for it except its references to Part 1, and that the movie was as flat as the pages of its script. Most critics agreed that it was a totally unneeded sequel which does nothing whatsoever for the legacy of the original tale. Unlike Part 1, Part 2 has also not grown in stature with age, and for good reason. By this stage, the magic was gone. I couldn't find much about Michael Ender's thoughts on this second installment, but I can't see how he would have enjoyed it. The script hacks together sections of his book and incorporates characters, but the story and dialogue here meanders along without any sense of wonder. And the same can be said for the special effects. Despite the increased budget, reportedly pegged at $35 million, it's difficult to see where that extra money was spent. Most of the returning Fantasia characters look off-puttingly different. I mean, just look at Falcor. The poor guy looks knackered. Equally, the new residents of Fantasia never have much charm to begin with, especially when compared to the first film. The human cast are fine, I guess, even if it's always odd having a completely new cast replacing already recognised faces. But director Miller doesn't seem to prioritise eliciting much emotional depth from them in the way Wolfgang Petersen did. Apparently, there were numerous drafts of the script delivered by Howard before the producers signed it off, but really, this was the one they gave the green light to? A pound-shop retread of the invisible menace from the first film, but this time with added pantomime villains on top and minus any attempts at deeper meaning. This feels like the series' first try at lurching towards appealing more to an American audience, but it's not done in a way which carried a through line from Part 1. The first movie seemed somewhat special, unique. This is just another film, and not a particularly good one. The NeverEnding Story 2 was released in Germany with the subtitle of In Search of Fantasia in the autumn of 1990. Though it was a success and one of the now reunified country's biggest hits of the year, total admissions of 3.2 million were almost 2 million down on the first film. After a Christmas rollout across the likes of Japan, Australia and the UK, Warner Bros. Launched the renamed NeverEnding Story 2 in US cinemas in February of '91. Once again hitting 4th place in the box office top 10 on the first week of its release, the next chapter failed to overtake Home Alone, which had been on release for 22 weeks at this point. In the end, the film grossed just over $17 million in North America, which, although a drop-off from Part 1, was within 75% of the box office gross of the first film. Although when the first film was considered to be a bit of a bomb in the US, it's still maybe not so great. Though precise data is difficult to come by, Tim Hampton, who executive produced the second film and would end up producing Part 3, because yes, there is a Part 3, noted that the first two films combined grossed $150 million at the worldwide box office. Given Part 1 hit almost $100 million exactly, one can then surmise that Part 2 made around $50 million, or half the original film. Something which movies used to be able to fall back on, however, was video sales and rentals. Though the streaming system has completely upended this revenue source nowadays, even bad films could get a second life from video sales. And The NeverEnding Story 2 was another success on video, with strong sales leading to the notion of the third film being a goer. And this time, in the US at least, it could theoretically be a success without even making it to cinemas at all. especially if the film could flip the entire concept of the NeverEnding Story on its head and bring the residents of Fantasia to Earth, and put Bastian in high school to try to tap into that teen market. What on earth could go wrong? It would be the mid-90s before another NeverEnding Story film would see the light of day. And when I say see the light of day, it would be more accurate to say that it stumbled out of bed half drunk the morning after a massive night out, and then fell down the stairs. In early 1993, producer Dieter Giesler, the only constant presence to be part of the franchise's production from the beginning, and his new partner Tim Hampton, announced that the prequel would indeed be making its way to screens, and that it would have little to do with what had come before. In fact, as Hampton put it at the time, worldwide success was no longer the priority. They wanted more US market penetration. Both earlier films were not such big draws in the States as they were, say, Germany. That's why we've opened up the script a great deal, to stop it being a movie obviously just for 8-year-olds. Author Michael Ender would have nothing to do with the process this time. Aside from his characters and places being in the thing, the producers now had carte blanche to do as they pleased with the residents of Fantasia. We own all the rights to the title now. Michael Ender had certain rights on the previous 2 movies, but here we're clear and free to do what we want. To that end, the producers hired American Jeff Lieberman to deliver the screenplay. Lieberman had been known for writing and directing cult horror films such as Blue Sunshine and Just Before Dawn, as well as making the bonkers 1988 alien VHS sci-fi romantic comedy, Remote Control. With the story centering around the Fantasia cast making the journey to Earth, Jim Henson's Creature Shop were hired to design creatures that were convincing in scenes in the real world. I say this with love and as a huge fan of Jim Henson and the Henson Company's work, but not even they could save this one. In search of a director, they ended up hiring Brit Peter MacDonald, who had previously taken the reins of Rambo 3 in the late 80s and also made the 1992 Damon Wayans vehicle Mo Money, which, for me, is an underrated early 90s comedy if you haven't seen it. He'd also worked on the likes of Labyrinth, Legend, The Empire Strikes Back and Batman, so theoretically this was a good choice. But things clearly didn't run smoothly. After the shoot finished, MacDonald was essentially locked out of the NeverEnding Story 3 edit suite as the producers took an even more ironclad grip on the series. To further attempt to, as the producers put it, broaden the franchise's appeal, Jason James Richter was brought in as the third different Bastian in 3 films. Richter had just had his big break with Free Willy, a film which saw him befriend an orca whale and that took home over $150 million at cinemas in 1993. Cast as the main villain of the prequel was a very young Jack Black, who had barely been in any films at this stage, but still manages to be the best thing in this one. You can see the star potential, as bad as the material is. The NeverEnding Story 3 saw a now teenage Bastian, whose father had remarried, leaving him with a well-meaning mother-in-law and a stepsister who didn't like him. His new sibling thinks he's a loser, and Bastian has also found himself the target of Jack Black's group, the Nasties, with a naff prologue having already informed us of a prophecy that the Nasty would one day arrive in Fantasia. Escaping the Nasty Boys, the Nasties, Bastian finds both the bookkeeper and the NeverEnding Story book in the school library for some reason, although both look strangely different, and travels back to Fantasia. But Jack Black gets the book in the real world, starts to use it against the magical land, along with some unexpected Fantasia faces who also travel through dimensions in the most ridiculous way imaginable. From there, chaos ensues, junior rockbiters climb up Mount Rushmore, Falcor gets involved in some ridiculous airline product placement, and the whole thing descends into even more of a painful mess of a movie. Warner Bros. Had an option to buy the worldwide rights for Part 3, but in a sign of where things were by this stage, they decided against it, instead agreeing to release it in Germany, where some success was guaranteed no matter the quality of the film, as well as the UK, Spain, Japan, and a few other territories. In the US though, presumably having watched the absolute state of the newest installment, they decided against taking up their option to distribute Escape from Fantasia in North American cinemas. The NeverEnding Story 3 was released in October 1994 in Germany without having secured a US distributor, and it went on to gross $5 million, but it wouldn't make an appearance in North America until February 1996, after Miramax had eventually picked it up. Though it got a limited release in theatres, Miramax's main interest was to release the thing on video, and it barely saw the light of day in North American cinemas. Reviews were relatively scarce, but what there were didn't exactly deliver ringing endorsements. One reviewer summed it up very handily: "The NeverEnding Story lives up to its title in the worst way possible." The fact that this film even exists in real life is pretty mind-blowing. It is an almost iconic example of how not to make a sequel work, a fever dream of focus group driven planning and bizarre ideas that end up even worse than they sounded they could be. This is absolute paint by numbers tosh. Which has achieved unifying both those who loved and disliked the first film and those who disliked and defended Part 2 in agreement that this could be one of the poorest sequels ever made. The thing is, if you break this down, removing the Fantasia moments, this is essentially a C-list 90s teen drama about a boy suffering through his new step-family and bullying. Not only is that part not even done well, but it also wastes the entire point of something with the depth of the NeverEnding Story. Totally homogenized, totally uninteresting, but then combined with the frankly embarrassing elements involving Fantasia, it's a heady brew of awfulness, and it's not a surprise that it has been considered such a disaster for so long. This is a Happy Meal version of my so-called life, with added rockbiter singing Born to be Wild. There are so many questions here. Why is Julie Cox's childlike empress so clearly no longer a child? Why have the Fantasia creatures seemingly all had brain transplants and become complete morons?
May I talk to you for a second? I'm a little lost.
And where exactly has Atreyu gone? In the simplest visual terms, the decline of the series can be seen in the changing faces of Falcor the Luck Dragon, from legitimately cute and wise to red-eyed and tired to what on earth is that?
This is not my favorite part of the story.
In watching the third film, I actually look back at what I said about Part 2 and reflect on how much worse it could have been. It's still objectively bad overall, but it is still a competently made movie. From a technical perspective, Part 3 makes Part 2 look like the final season of 6 Feet Under. During filming, director Peter McDonald was quoted as saying that the NeverEnding Story 3 would appeal to all nationalities and ensure a fourth film. I can honestly say I've had a very good time directing what I hope will be a vast improvement on the first two films. Given that the film went nowhere in most countries, McDonald was barred from his own edit, Escape from Fantasia is easily the worst of the three movies and one of the poorest sequels of all time, and that this crash and burn ended this iteration of the NeverEnding Story film series, I'd say in hindsight pretty much every part of that quote is untrue. In many of the movies we will be covering in this series, the failure of the sequel would come down to one simple sentence: it was a bad, unnecessary idea in the first place. But for the NeverEnding Story, at least the initial sequel was, theoretically, not a bad idea. There was no need to try to come up with a fresh approach. The second half of the source material was there and ready to be adapted. Not that I think it really needed a sequel, but it was a viable option. Although when it comes to sequels, being a viable option is less than half the battle. The real proof is in the pudding. How that sequel is delivered is everything. Over the decades, critical sentiment has shifted somewhat on the original NeverEnding Story film. It has become generally acknowledged as a fantasy classic. It currently has an 84% score on Rotten Tomatoes, even higher than the audience score. Equally, disdain for the second and especially the third film has hardened. Earlier in this video, I talked about how the nothing seemed to represent depression, and going beyond that, the story told in the first movie feels like a metaphor for the stages of grief and the recovery a person goes through as part of the grieving process. Deep stuff for what ostensibly is a kid's movie, but that feels like part of the reason it has remained important for so many people who are now adults. The threat in the NeverEnding Story is existential, invisible, internal. The villains in the later movies are paint-by-numbers characters without any sort of interesting motives. The sequels lost the essence of what made the NeverEnding Story work, and by part 3, all goodwill is chucked in a dumpster and set on fire. The NeverEnding Story remains beloved to this day, as shown by it making a return to cinemas for its 40th anniversary. The original book has been translated into 45 different languages and gone on to sell 8 million copies worldwide. An animated series ran for 2 seasons in the mid-90s, and a live-action series, Tales from the NeverEnding Story, which took yet more liberties with Ender's source material, made it onto HBO in the early 2000s. News of a brand new series of NeverEnding Story films has also rumbled on for what feels like decades, but complications with securing the rights have scuppered all attempts. Despite this, it has remained hot property in Hollywood. In more recent years, Stranger Things' use of the original 1984 theme tune helped bring the story to the consciousness of a new generation of viewers, and earlier this year, it was confirmed that the estate of Michael Ender, who passed away in 1995, had agreed to co-produce a new series of NeverEnding Story movies, with the production house behind the likes of The King's Speech, Lion, and The Power of the Dog. Now that there is a new film series on the horizon, maybe there will be a happier conclusion for a movie saga steeped in memories for so many. Michael Ender's estate clearly wants his work to be remembered differently on the big screen. But I'd personally rather we started to see some different stories told. That original movie is my childhood, and I'm tired of endless remakes and reimaginings anyway. With the original film franchise, however, there is still an undeniable sense of what might have been. The first film was so striking, so engulfing, such a unique proposition and overall package, treating mature subject matter and fantastical ideas with equal amounts of respect, that the sequels feel like nothing but a soulless missed opportunity. When I'm a dad, I look forward to watching the NeverEnding Story with my kid when the time is right. I don't think there could ever be a right time to bother to introduce them to the sequels though. Wolfgang Petersen's original film remains an indelible part of 1980s cinema, and that is something which no number of bad follow-ups could ever completely turn to nothing. You might say that its legacy is never ending. Coal, slice, culture slice, culture slice. Throughout Hollywood history, perhaps the most questionable record of sequels comes from the comedy genre. I mean, for every Hot Shots Part 2, there are many more Son of the Masks hanging around. Even films that manage to restore the original key players have regularly fallen flat, attempting to recapture a moment which is long gone, which is to say nothing of the litany of examples where the key players have been overhauled. Going back to the well for a second go, especially years later, is a supremely tough task. In the second episode of Sequelpalooza, we covered a notorious example of the downfall of a wannabe comedy franchise, a film in which barely anyone who made the first movie so special returned, one which almost everyone involved thought was a terrible idea, and a major summer release so misguided that it has become a byword for the worst of late 80s Hollywood. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you Caddyshack II. Have you ever finished watching a movie and thought, this is great, can't wait for the sequel? And then when you actually saw the sequel, you said to yourself, man, they really should have left this alone after one? Well then this is the show for you. Welcome to Sequelpalooza.
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 Sequel.
The series that takes a hit movie, asks what happened next, and discovers that it's usually a complete and utter mess. In each episode, we'll be telling the story of a different film series from across the decades. And today, for our second edition, we're going to be exploring the history of one of the most iconic sports movies and the most epic cinematic falls from grace of all time. Caddyshack managed to snatch victory from the jaws of defeat in the early 1980s, going from a raging party of a production under an inexperienced director to somehow becoming a smash hit and even a cultural landmark, helping to establish movie stars and major Hollywood players in the process. 8 years later, however, when it came to its successor, Caddyshack II flopped hard with audiences and critics. Derided as one of the worst sequels of all time, it remains a shining example of how not to follow up a hit movie. But how exactly did Caddyshack go from partying at the clubhouse to being lost in the sandbank? Did anything go right when it came to Part 2's truly tumultuous journey to the screen? And how does the evolution of a dancing gopher encapsulate the rapid decline of the series? Caddyshack returns to the tour and immediately drops off the leaderboard. For good. This is Sequelpalooza.
What you are about to see has a mechanical gopher in it. The money could have been spent on more of me. Thank you.
At the dawn of the 1980s, the remnants of 70s culture remained somewhat omnipresent. MTV, which would have such an enormous impact on the sound, star names and aesthetic of popular culture, wouldn't launch until the second half of 1981, and despite a considerable late 70s backlash and the fact that its days were numbered, disco still had some presence in the charts. In fact, the biggest hit of the summer of 1980 was Funky Town. The 80s would eventually see drastic change take place in culture and the wider world. For now though, the #1 song in America at the start of the year was the same as the last #1 of the 1970s, the Pina Colada song. But there was one trend which began in the 70s that would carry on through the 80s and beyond. Film comedy was in the midst of a not-so-quiet revolution. Released 2 years earlier in the summer of 1978, National Lampoon's Animal House had become a surprise blockbuster, taking home over $120 million in its initial cinema run against a budget of just $3 million. The fact that it remained until Ghostbusters in 1984 the most profitable comedy of all time completely reshaped Hollywood's perspective on the genre going forward.
Sorry.
Establishing the trend for slobs versus snobs comedies, Animal House remains one of the most influential films of this or any era. It was also a major Hollywood breakthrough for two of its writers, Harold Ramis and Doug Kenney. Ramis and Kenney had both built up strong resumes in the comedy world before Animal House, notably with the likes of Second City and National Lampoon respectively, but they were now able to penetrate the mainstream. Kenney's work on National Lampoon would become enormously influential in ushering in a new era for comedy before they both left their day jobs to write Animal House with another Lampoon writer, Chris Miller. It was the first screenplay any of them had produced. Nobody at Universal Pictures expected the film to be such an enormous hit, but it was, going on to be a cultural event. More important than that, to many in Hollywood though, it cost very little and made a lot of money. Despite the success of Animal House though, Ramis didn't have a straightforward job getting his next picture, which he wanted to direct, off the ground. Ramis and Kenney organised a pitch meeting with executive producer John Peters, who had signed an exclusive development deal with Orion Pictures, a newer studio with a distribution agreement with Warner's. Fresh off the Animal House bonanza, Ramis and Kenney pitched ideas such as a satirical look at the American Nazi Party and something about a revisionist Marxist Western, but they didn't get very far. Another idea, however, did pique Peters' interest, and it was one which came from Ramis's co-writers Kenney and Brian Doyle Murray. This idea could essentially be boiled down to a single line: Animal House on a golf course. Their experiences of working as golf caddies in their youth shaped the narrative and characters which populated the script they would deliver, Caddyshack. The core story of Caddyshack initially revolved around a down-on-his-luck caddy who is vying for a scholarship as he wants to go to college, and the life of the caddies at Bushwood Country Club. But in reality, the film's plot was rendered as flimsy as a boat when an anchor falls through it, as it became clear that the level of comedy talent they had managed to cast could not be contained, and the members, staff and residents of the club, who were supposed to be supporting characters, ended up being focal points of the film. Though the main caddy Danny, played by Michael O'Keefe, remained an important part of the story, other caddies' roles ended up being drastically cut. As Ramis himself put it once, they had planned to make a coming-of-age film and instead ended up with a Marx Brothers movie. The comedians who did take up far more screen time than originally planned also became the iconic players who have made Caddyshack the surprise and long-lasting success that it became. Bill Murray was one of a number of new comedy TV stars established on Saturday Night Live, the revolutionary late-night weekly show. He managed to lead a hit movie in 1979, Meatballs, co-written by Ramis, although he had already been cast in Caddyshack by that point. He also happened to be Brian Doyle Murray's brother. He took the role of Carl, the groundskeeper charged with catching the film's other protagonist, Mr. Gopher. More on him later. Chevy Chase had been one of the original stars of Saturday Night Live and had transitioned to film work after leaving the show, legitimizing his big screen career with the movie Foul Play in 1978, which was a hit and earned Chase a Golden Globe nomination. It's fair to say that he was a household name by this point, but it wasn't like Chevy Chase was the bankable comedy movie star he would become as the 1980s progressed. Chase had turned down a role in Animal House and he wasn't going to make the same mistake again. He played Zen Playboy Country Club heir Ty Webb. Rodney Dangerfield was a stand-up comedy name and a regular on The Tonight Show, but he hadn't established himself as a movie star at this point. When he auditioned for the role of Al, the real estate developer who doesn't quite fit into the stuffy country club, the story goes that he walked into the room, dropped his trousers and exclaimed, "Let's eat." He got the part. The lead roles were completed by sitcom star Ted Knight as the country club founder and the snob, unhappy with the influx of slobs to the course, whose feud with Dangerfield's Al ends up becoming the focal point of much of the movie. Doug Kenney, at 32 years of age, would combine his writing duties with the role of producer. He had, of course, never produced a movie before. Though Ramis didn't know how to make a movie, and Kenney had never produced one, they knew they wanted to shoot away from California to ensure more freedom from the execs. For the country club setting of the film, they secured the Rolling Hills Country Club in Davie, Florida, explaining to the studio that they wanted to avoid the Illinois-based film being set at a golf club with the palm trees of Southern California. They ended up shooting at a country club with, yes, palm trees. Production took place over an 11-week period between September and November 1979. The shoot was wild, quite literally. Hurricane David swept through Florida for large parts of it, delaying work considerably. Although, on the plus side, that did allow the cast and crew to party like mad in their hotel. Even when the weather was better, most still spent their nights partying. The drug intake around the shoot has become the stuff of legend, on a set which Chase once described as pretty nuts. Ramis reflected on this decades later. "We shot the movie in 1979. It was a pretty debauched country at the time. The cocaine business in southern Florida was mammoth, and everyone was doing everything." Fueled and ready to rock, the key creative players had been used to doing improv. They leaned into what they knew best. Subplots like Dangerfield's Al and Knight's snobby judge agreeing to a high-stakes pairs golf match, and largely improvised scenes such as the last-minute Bill Murray and Chevy Chase nighttime golfing edition ended up taking more and more prominence. As Chris Nashawati, whose excellent book, Caddyshack, The Making of a Hollywood Cinderella Story, is well worth picking up a copy of, points out, there was a script when they got to Florida to film, but they pretty much put it in the trash and let the really experienced improv comedians just go freestyle. 9 times out of 10 that was going to be a complete disaster, but they managed to pull this one off. But they did it by the skin of their teeth. The original edit is rumoured to have been 4.5 hours long. The gopher was a late addition, and let's talk about that gopher for a second. Created by John Dykstra, the legendary effects lead of Star Wars fame, the gopher was a mixture of puppet and animatronic hydraulics, and his team created the maze of tunnels seen in the movie. Much of this was done after the main shoot had wrapped, and allowed Ramis and team to knit together the disparate freewheeling comedy moments they'd managed to shoot into something more cohesive. In the years and decades that followed, he has become a valuable and profitable mascot. In many ways, the gopher made Caddyshack work. As producer John Peters stated, even if not many agreed with his summation at the time, "When I saw the gopher in, I felt like it was going to be a huge hit." Although this wouldn't be the case forever, for now, Mr. Gopher was on top of the world. Although, spoiler alert, things would get worse for him and us later in the decade. Anyway. As well as the film's score from Johnny Mandel, the soundtrack for Caddyshack featured not only the iconic Any Way You Want It by Journey, musical inspiration for the Dangerfield shuffle scene on the course, but also a selection of songs from Kenny Loggins, an already successful singer-songwriter and future king of the movie soundtrack, who provided the single I'm Alright as the film's theme tune. Reaching number 7 on the Billboard Hot 100, Caddyshack would prove a pivotal moment for Loggins' own career in movies, just as it did for many of its stars. It's fair to say that Caddyshack's soundtrack featured top 40 bangers, and even became something of a template for many films' use of popular music as the 80s progressed. Caddyshack opened on July 25, 1980, at a time when the likes of the Blues Brothers, Airplane and, yes, Cheech and Chong's next movie were already in cinemas. The box office behemoth towering over everything else released that summer, however, was The Empire Strikes Back, which went on to make over $209 million in North America, more than double anything else managed across the year. Although Caddyshack was unlikely to ever compete with the sequel to George Lucas's all-conquering Star Wars, things initially looked bleak for it to compete with other comedies of the time. Initial reviews weren't exactly glowing. dismissed as the latest misbegotten spawn of Animal House, and hanging evidence that Ramis wasn't prepared for the assignment or clever enough to fake it, even though both Gene Siskel and Roger Ebert liked it well enough. They were very much in the minority. The Boston Globe's review seemed to tie together the general consensus. Caddyshack represents everything that is wrong with contemporary film comedy. Box Office 2 wasn't mind-blowing, at least initially. Debuting in second place behind Empire Strikes Back, it never ended up making anything close to Animal House in cinemas. In the end though, it was a decent-sized hit. It drew almost $40 million in North America, dwarfing its budget, and would finish worldwide with over $60 million. It was also clear that the film had connected with an audience, and that it had the potential to maintain a huge second life in home media. Lord only knows how much residual cash it has made from its endless TV reruns, video, DVD and Blu-ray sales over the decades, but the movie has ended up well and truly becoming an indelible part of pop culture. I guess from me waxing lyrical about a puppet gopher, you can tell that I'm a fan of this movie. And it's true, I think Caddyshack is great. I mean, it's not objectively a great movie in some more technical aspects, some of the laughs are pretty juvenile, and even with the gopher, it's a bit disjointed at times. But in the ways that truly matter, it's really, really great. If you catch my drift. The construct of the movie is basic, of course, but it's the perfect platform for some of the best comic actors of the era to deliver a lot of their absolute finest work. Caddyshack is rough around the edges, and you can sense the chaotic set in almost every scene, but it's a glorious mess, and it's just a shame there aren't movies like this made much in the modern era. I mean, aside from the all-time classic quotable lines, it's worth watching for the dancing alone. Who knows if this style of movie would mesh with the expectations of younger audiences, but the ethos behind Caddyshack should be upheld and cherished. If ever a movie didn't need a sequel, it was this one, but this wouldn't be Sequelpalooza if things had been left alone after the first. If they really had to make a sequel, a rapid-fire return to the shack maybe could have worked alright. But what we ended up getting was far, far worse.
Hey, everybody! We're all gonna get late!
In the years between Caddyshack appearing at cinemas and its sequel's production chugging into gear, the world at large had seen drastic changes. And so had the key players who had made that strange 1980 golf comedy such a massive success. Harold Ramis had not only co-written and co-starred in Ghostbusters, which loomed over pop culture after its release in 1984, but he had also reunited with Chevy Chase to direct National Lampoon's Vacation, another franchise starter, a year earlier. It hadn't all gone swimmingly though. His 1986 Robin Williams comedy Club Paradise had flatlined almost totally, but by this point the Caddyshack director was a big Hollywood name. Speaking of Chevy, he had become one of the most recognisable faces of 80s cinema, starring in not just Vacation and its European sequel, but also Fletch, Spies Like Us, and The Three Amigos. He was so much a part of the establishment now that he'd even hosted the Oscars. Rodney Dangerfield had gone from a Hollywood rookie to a one-man comedy franchise, continuing stand-up success, but also starring in the likes of Easy Money and Back to School, the latter of which made more than $90 million in 1986. Bill Murray's career had headed to the stratosphere after he joined Ramis in Ghostbusters, a trajectory which would only continue in the late 80s and early 90s. His brother Brian continued to make regular appearances in major films, many of which co-starred his fellow Caddyshack alumni, while Michael O'Keefe starred in box office bombs like Savage Islands, Finders Keepers, and The Slugger's Wife. Doug Kenny, who at age 33 had achieved and influenced so much in modern American comedy, would sadly pass away on vacation in Hawaii just weeks after the release of Caddyshack, at a time when he was looking to escape what appeared at first to be the negative reaction to the film he had helped create. He would never be able to revel in its later success, and perhaps his untimely passing is another reason why a more immediate sequel wasn't developed. Ted Knight, such a big part of the success of that first film, would also pass in 1986 due to cancer. Caddyshack would prove to be his final film role. In the 1980s, the first real age of Hollywood's obsession with the sequel, it is perhaps a surprise that it took so long for the idea to bring back the Shack to gain some momentum, but so many of those involved had used it as a platform for future success that they didn't really need to return to Caddyshack, and the first movie had tied the story's loose ends up so nicely anyway. Warner Brothers, the studio behind it, were keen though. By the mid-80s, tentpole summer movies were a driving force for the industry, and Warners were missing a comedy, hit for their summer 1988 release slate. Rodney Dangerfield, who had made $35 grand for part 1, agreed to return when he realised he could make $7 million for making Caddyshack 2, and original executive producer John Peters was also on board. The plan was for Alan Meter, Dangerfield's director for Back to School, to take over helming duties. To ensure that Ramis, who had co-written Back to School for Dangerfield, was involved in the script, the studio used the old Krusty the Clown Canyonero approach. The studio begged me. They said, "Hey, we've got a great idea. The Shack is back." And I said, "No, I don't think so." But they said that Rodney really wanted to do it. The classic argument came up, which says that if you don't do it, someone will, and it will be really bad. Against his own better judgment, in the summer of 1987, he agreed to write the script along with his old Second City colleague PJ Tarokve. All the other stars were either unable or unwilling to be involved, and with so many years having passed, it was going to be very difficult to recapture whatever magic there was left. Things started unraveling from pretty much the very beginning of the process. Dangerfield rapidly became disillusioned with the script. Chevy Chase, who had very clearly shown no interest in coming back, eventually did agree to return in what amounted to little more than a cameo for a favour and a 7-figure check. But his heart wasn't in it either. After the studio had spent more than $2 million on pre-production and even built him his own personal sauna on set, with less than a month to go before filming was due to begin, Dangerfield could see the writing was on the wall and left the project, a move which instigated major legal battles between him and Warner's. His director Meter was relieved of his duties, and Ramis took Dangerfield's departure as his cue to exit stage left as well. Even though his name remained on the movie, the final script ended up having very little to do with his original screenplay. Without a director or a star, the script was a mess, and essentially nobody from the original was still on board. Aside from an almost entirely disinterested Chevy Chase, and of course Mr. Gopher, Warner's had a movie project to save, and they were still hell-bent on a summer 1988 release. Alan Arkush agreed to take on the director's chair without any knowledge of the legal trouble between Warner's and Dangerfield. Years later, he admitted that Caddyshack II eventually sent him to therapy. "I should have never made this movie. What was I thinking?" Arkush had directed the 1978 Ramones starring Rock and Roll High School, along with many episodes of TV shows such as The Twilight Zone, LA Law, and Moonlighting. He was keen to make another movie, and this was set to be a fairly major one, I guess. To replace Dangerfield in the lead role, the studio wanted Jackie Mason. Arkush raised concerns, but was told that without Mason, the green light on production would be gone. The screenplay, given an uncredited overhaul by Who Framed Roger Rabbit writers Jeffrey Price and Steven Seaman, revolved around Jack, played by Mason, a rich property developer in the vein of Dangerfield's character from Part 1. He is encouraged by his daughter, played by Jessica Lundy, to join the Bushwood Club so she can climb the social ladder. His application is rejected, and he also makes an enemy in the form of Robert Stack's snobby country club president. Jack buys a majority share in the country club from Chevy Chase's Ty Webb, turns it into a pretty horrifying golf amusement park called Jackie's Wacky Golf, and eventually it is agreed that a golf match will take place for control of the club. There's also a subplot involving Dan Aykroyd being hired as an assassin, but ending up in a war with the returning Mr. Gopher, and Randy Quaid steals a few scenes as Mason's firebrand lawyer. Though golf and caddying aren't really prioritised, future Weekend at Bernie's star Jonathan Silverman does play the lead caddy here. The shoot was less chaotic than the first film, but also far less enjoyable. The director struggled with Mason constantly forgetting his lines, the costume department struggled with Mason eating so much at catering that his clothes had to be regularly let out, and the golf trainers struggled with Mason clearly showing absolutely no aptitude for the sport. Chevy Chase showed the whole thing complete disdain from the beginning, and Dan Aykroyd, who had agreed to replace Murray as the gopher chaser of Part 2, put on a weird, off-putting voice that the filmmakers hated, but at this stage presumably most had written this off as a disaster already. When it was ready to be screened, it was painfully obvious how true that was. Ramis recalls going to one of the first research screenings and crawling out of the theatre because we didn't want anyone to see us. Even Mason seemed to know where things were headed, if you read between the lines, when he appeared on David Letterman in the days before it hit cinemas.
Tell me about the movie, Caddyshack II. This opens Friday, huh? But did the movie turn out all right?
I think the movie is going to be one of the great sensations of all time. I say it for only one reason. It didn't come out yet. Nobody could call me a liar.
Hi, Culture Slice here, and welcome to this week's edition of Film 1988. After a summer dominated by the technical marvel that is Who Framed Roger Rabbit, Eddie Murphy in Coming to America, and Crocodile Dundee 2, it's time to head back to the shack for Caddyshack 2. After the absolute carnage behind the scenes in bringing this sequel to the screen, with barely any of the original cast or crew on board for Part 2, could this somehow end up becoming the comedy hit of the summer? Sorry, got stuck in time there, back doing my old late 80s TV presenting gig for a second. Anyway, Caddyshack 2 was released on July 22nd, 1988, and when it did come out, the reality of the sequel's awfulness was exposed for the world to see. It received almost universally scathing reviews, lambasted by critics as shoddy, lazy, and numbingly stupid, a disaster, and a pathetic sequel to a great comedy. The New York Times review summed it up. Caddyshack 2 is the kind of film that sends careers spiraling downward. So, yeah, Caddyshack 2, everybody! Woo, yeah! Where do you start with this one? Jackie Mason had been a notable comedian with a rocky career path for decades. He saw a career resurgence in the 80s though, after appearing in both The Jerk and Mel Brooks' History of the World Part 1. Even if he was a recognisable name, however, anyone with even a passing knowledge of him would understand that the studio's choice of casting him in Caddyshack 2, even at this time, was thoroughly perplexing. His romance with Diane Cannon might be one of the least convincing ever committed to film. Mason playing the Dangerfield part, fighting against the snobs of the country club, is one of the most miscast roles in cinema history, no doubt about it. But the entire cast, talented though some of them might be, looked very dodgy from the start. Replacement actors playing thinly veiled caricatures of characters from the first movie. I imagine Dan Aykroyd almost immediately regretted his last-minute decision to take a role here. This is not his finest work. Robert Stack and Randy Quaid are just working with such poor stuff, although they didn't phone it in, unlike some. The humour in Caddyshack 2 is so base level it's embarrassing, and almost always unfunny. When the first film had comedians in their pomp, riffing freestyle improvisations, creating whole scenes on the fly with numerous iconic lines, this feels almost entirely contrived. The decision to make this one to achieve a PG certificate neuters a lot of the potential, I guess, but the story and characters are so poorly written in the end, it wouldn't have made a difference whatever rating the film was striving for. Even the Gopher, an iconic addition to Part 1, is a much less welcome guest here. The character evolution of Mr. Gopher in Part 2 is totally bemusing, and the speaking voice it's given is a bit disturbing. And genuinely, who is this movie made for? Were they aiming for the family market? One legitimate positive of Caddyshack 2 was that they managed to get Kenny Loggins to record a new theme tune. Like many of the stars of that original film, Loggins' film career had taken off after Caddyshack. He'd provided memorable songs for the likes of Footloose, Over the Top, and of course, Top Gun. For Caddyshack 2, he delivered the 80s-tastic and still awesome to this day, Nobody's Fool, a song which ended up being far more fondly remembered than the movie it came from. A movie this bad does not deserve a theme song this good. Nobody's Fool would eventually make it to number 8 on the Billboard Hot 100, making Loggins the first male solo artist to achieve 4 top 10 singles from 4 different soundtrack albums. An 80s stat if there ever was one. So that's one positive for Caddyshack 2, I guess. But the thing is, Nobody's Fool would have been a hit with or without the movie, so this really has to go down as a partial credit at best. It does make the opening titles one of the best parts of the film though. Anyway, Caddyshack 2 was released on July 22nd, 1988 and became a massive bomb at the box office, managing to make it to number 8 in its first week on release, behind Big Top Pee-wee. After one more week, it would drop out of the US box office top 10 for good. The Shack was back for 2 weeks. In the end, it made just $11 million in cinemas after costing more than $25 million to make. Everything was so last minute with Caddyshack 2, and almost everyone involved soon realised it was a horrible mistake. Ramis bailed when there was talk of Mason replacing Dangerfield, and the entire project really should have followed suit. Caddyshack 2 remains a monument of precisely how a sequel should not be done.
Hey, Jack, how's it going? Terrible. I'm hungry and I have to go to the bedroom.
It seems to me that there are 2 main ways to deliver a successful sequel. 1. To keep the party going, maintain and expand on what made the original movie work so well with already established characters. Or 2. To have a concept which goes well beyond the confines of that first film, maybe with an increased budget or scale, totally flipping and exceeding the audience's expectations in a good way. Caddyshack 2 failed to get close to either of these benchmarks. The first film's production had been a freewheeling party of a shoot, a product of its time, with all the positives and negatives that came with that for cast and crew. Its sequel was a corporate, sanitized wannabe, a representation of the worst tendencies of 80s Hollywood without retaining any of its charm. Caddyshack 2 is not so bad that it ends up actually being perversely good, it's just painful to watch. Aside from the actual quality of the film, timing is of course the other issue. Caddyshack was released when the Slobs vs Snobs R-rated comedy was fresh, but by the time 8 years had passed, Caddyshack 2 felt like the most uncool film ever made. It took 8 years and felt like it was hacked together in an afternoon. In some ways, the dulling down of Caddyshack represents a wider change in Hollywood and society as a whole. The wild days of the late 70s had been followed by reality checks. 2 years after Caddyshack producer Kenny's passing, John Belushi, the hard partying star who had helped make Animal House such a hit, died at the same age of just 33. It wouldn't have been possible to make a movie the way they had in 1979 when it came to the sequel, but it still didn't need to be this bad. As originally envisaged though, Caddyshack 2 could have been somewhat less of a mess. With Dangerfield returning and Ramis on scripting duties, the plan had been for Sam Kinison, a wild stand-up comedian and a close friend of Dangerfield who had also been in Back to School, to join the cast. Who knows if that could have worked, but I don't see how it could have possibly been nearly as awful as what we did get. Such is life, I guess. Maybe if Caddyshack had been more about the caddies as first intended, it would have ended up just another forgotten slobs versus snobs movie arriving in the wake of Animal House. But in the end, largely thanks to its casting, we got something much more special. The first film's enduring appeal can be partly laid at its broad audience. Teens and young adults enjoyed it, but so did the older country club crowd. Rodney Dangerfield was making Reagan cry with laughter later in the 80s. The boomer audience would gravitate to the likes of him and Chevy Chase. They became the acceptable faces of raucous comedy. Their careers would peak in the years which followed Caddyshack, becoming synonymous with the 1980s as two of its most recognisable film headliners. By the 1990s though, their stars had fallen somewhat. Chevy was briefly hosting his own truly disastrous late-night talk show, and Rodney was voicing a talking dog called Rover Dangerfield, although both he and Mason did become two of the most memorable guest stars of the golden age of The Simpsons.
As long as everybody's here, let's party!
After its release, Caddyshack became an example of how, in life, success and failure are not defined instantly. Nobody was assuming it would be lauded when it opened in 1980 to lukewarm reviews and box office, but over time it has become just that. Feels like one of those movies which has always been there, and given its production history, it's something of a miracle that it ended up the way it did. The film remains a cultural touchpoint more than 40 years after its release, constantly referenced in popular culture and regularly mentioned as one of the greatest comedies of all time. Is it the funniest sports movie ever? Possibly. Is Caddyshack 2 the worst sequel of all time? Honestly, there's an argument that it could be, certainly of the 80s, but that might ring true for numerous other films we will be covering in this series. Rubbish, like beauty, is in the eye of the beholder, and there's maybe a couple of small moments which could save it from the eternal abyss of abysmal cinematic failures. Maybe. In the end though, time washes away Hollywood's sins. While Part 2 languishes on Rotten Tomatoes with terrible critic and audience scores, although 4% does seem quite high, its predecessor still stands proudly. Reviews have become kinder to Caddyshack over time. The paying public made it a sensation not too long after it arrived. Whatever the absolute state of that sequel ended up being, we're still left with an original which somehow became one of the very best comedies of an iconic era for movies, despite, or most likely because of, the fact that you can almost smell the stench of 70s party coming off the screen. Because, in the immortal words of one of the best soundtrack songs of the 1980s, any way you want it, that's the way you need it, any way you want it. Or, as Ty Webb would put it, be the ball. Just be the ball.
your sexy girlfriend.
Do you like bangers? Bangers. Well, then you're going to love Culture Slice Dance Party 4. Featuring 80 of today's hottest dance floor hits. With more of what you're looking for, there's enough to get even the werewolf school dance party jumping. Do not accept any imitation. Culture Slice Dance Party 4. Not available now in any stores.
Turn it on and rip the knob off.
Welcome back to our very first Sequelpalooza marathon. You know, sometimes in life you can almost inadvertently end up capturing lightning in a bottle, and no matter how much you try to replicate the circumstances that delivered it, any more attempts to follow up that success can be doomed to failure. In our third and final episode today, we're going to be taking a look at the most financially successful high school werewolf teen comedy drama featuring the star of Back to the Future ever made, as well as the sequel which followed 2 years later with a new rookie lead name, very little positive momentum, and a storyline which felt extremely familiar. But could Teen Wolf 2 somehow defy the odds and become a banker at the box office in late 1987? Let's jump back into the Sequelpalooza time machine to find out. Have you ever finished watching a movie and thought, this is great, can't wait for the sequel? And then when you actually saw the sequel, you said to yourself, man, they really should have left this alone after one? Well then, this is the show for you. Welcome to Sequelpalooza.
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 Sequel. The series that takes a hit movie, asks what happened next, and discovers that it's usually a complete and utter mess. In each episode, we'll be telling the story of a different film series from across the decades. And today... hello? Oh, hi, boss. Yes, good, thanks. Just introducing the new episode of Sequelpalooza. Oh, okay. You want an episode suitable for Halloween? Right. What were you thinking? Is that a Halloween movie? Wasn't it released in August? And didn't the sequel not make it out until November? Ah, right, we want something that works for Halloween but isn't too much Halloween, so that it can still get views for the channel for the rest of the year? Gotcha. In that case, yes sir, werewolves are Halloweeny, and lots of people do dress up like them for Halloween, and that sequel is considered terrifyingly terrible. Okay, great, thanks boss, brilliant work as always. Teen Wolf it is. Whether you're watching this at the spookiest time of year or not, today we'll be covering a hair-raisingly scary example of that most horrifying of cultural artifacts, a really bad sequel. Arriving at the ideal moment to ride the crest of the wave of Hollywood's most bankable new name, the small-scale monster comedy Teen Wolf became a hit despite a less than perfect critical response in the summer of 1985, making more than 20 times its budget in cinemas alone. 2 years later, however, without its headliner and attempting to pull off the same trick, with essentially the original movie copy and pasted, Teen Wolf 2 became a frighteningly iconic example of how spookily awful follow-up films really can be. How did the original Teen Wolf manage to shapeshift its way to becoming a breakout hit? Where did it all go wrong for a sequel that failed to show nearly as much bite? And is there any party quite like an 80s werewolf party?
Number 60, from Teen Wolf 2.
A sequel that will leave you howling at the moon. Ow! This is Sequelpalooza. summer of 1985, the WWF was becoming a major force in the entertainment business after the massive success of March's very first WrestleMania. Eddie Murphy had just hosted the second MTV Video Music Awards, and July's Live Aid charity concerts had been seen by an estimated worldwide TV audience of over 1.5 billion people. At cinemas, the biggest film of the summer, and eventually the entire year, was in the process of sending its young star's fame into the stratosphere. It's hard to quantify just how hot Michael J. Fox was in the summer of '85. Having already become a star in the role of Alex on Family Ties, it was his part in Robert Zemeckis' Back to the Future that would be the secret to even bigger success for the young Canadian actor. Though he had been the first choice for the role of Marty McFly, Fox hadn't been the original lead actor in Back to the Future, as his Family Ties schedule clashed with filming of the movie. After a few weeks of filming, however, he did end up replacing Eric Stoltz, who producers felt just wasn't working in the role. It's wild to think that there's an alternative timeline without Michael J. Fox in Back to the Future, but that was very nearly everyone's reality. The timeline we did get saw Marty and Doc's movie make its debut in North American cinemas on July 3rd, 1985, and become an instant sensation. Spending 11 of the next 12 weeks in the #1 spot at the box office, it would eventually go on to become the 5th highest grossing film of the 1980s and hold a position as a true classic that will surely never change. Michael J. Fox, already a teen idol thanks to Family Ties, was suddenly now a truly bankable film star as well. The all-conquering scale of Back to the Future was also incredibly good news for a smaller scale werewolf comedy that Fox had made months prior to him being installed in the blockbuster of the year, especially when that other film was now scheduled for release in August of '85. Less than 2 months after Back to the Future had crash-landed into cinemas and the wider cultural zeitgeist. In late 1984, as Robert Zemeckis' film was going into production on the Universal lot with Eric Stoltz still as its lead, Michael J. Fox had been in another part of California, making Teen Wolf, a coming-of-age werewolf comedy drama under the direction of Rod Daniel. Director Daniel had made a lot of episodes of TV prior to securing the Teen Wolf job, but he longed to make a movie. As soon as he read the script from fellow film debutantes Matthew Wiseman and Jeff Loeb, he knew this was the project for him. As Daniel remembers, he got the job as he was the only director who didn't see it as a werewolf movie, but instead saw it as the story of a father and son. Which is true, but it's also about a basketball-playing werewolf. Anyway, werewolf movies were kind of trendy at that point. The likes of An American Werewolf in London and The Howling had been hits earlier in the decade, and The Howling 2, which was given the awesome subtitle Your Sister is a Werewolf, was released the same month as Teen Wolf. Though we'd already seen high school werewolves on screen before in the likes of 1981's horror comedy Full Moon High, Michael J. Fox's creature feature could follow on from these films, but with a different tone, whilst also tapping into the teen market. The teen wolf market? Teen market? Anyway, Atlantic Releasing, the studio behind the film, wanted a cheap and cheerful teen comedy which could potentially live up to the success of their 1983 Nicolas Cage star of Valley Girl, and Teen Wolf was certainly cheap and cheerful. Though the exact production budget is a matter for conjecture, according to Fox, the pure cost of making the film came at little more than $1 million, with additional post-production, marketing and distribution costs taking that up to roughly $4 million. Either way, this was far from an expensive film, with the hope being that its star's name value from Family Ties would carry it into profit. And that was before his star went supernova. As it happens, Teen Wolf was unlikely to be made without Fox being attached, but when his Family Ties co-star Meredith Baxter became pregnant, her time off allowed just enough of a window of opportunity for him to make the film before going back to the day job. Fox himself has reflected on the fact that he largely took the role as it was a job and he needed more exposure if he was going to succeed as a movie star. It was a low-budget, silly movie, but at that point, I needed all the visibility I could get. The story of Teen Wolf revolved around Fox's Scott, an unremarkable Nebraska teenager who plays for his high school's god-awful Beavers basketball team, although he does have an awesome best friend called Styles, played by Jerry Levine. Scott fancies Laurie Griffin's Pamela, his dream girl who is going out with classic 80s teen movie meathead Mick, played by Mark Arnold. Sadly, Scott can't see that his best mate Booth, aka Susan City, both fancies him and could be the one. Scott starts to notice a lot of weird things going on with his body, and a game which sees him and Booth snogging in the cupboard goes wrong when he starts to show werewolf-like tendencies, before he goes full werewolf later that night at home. His father Harold explains that it's a family curse, but he was hoping it might skip a generation or two. Initially aiming to keep it hidden to the world at large, Scott instead werewolves up during a Beavers game, eventually leading his team on a winning streak as Wolf Fever sweeps the school. Drifting apart from Booth with fame increasing, will Scott discover what's really important in life or be consumed by the trappings of his new success? Can Scott learn to control his new wolf alter ego? Can the team of no-hopers actually take it all the way to the championship title? And can the filmmakers find an epic 80s werewolf-themed banger to play at the high school spring dance? I think we know the answer to that last question. Teen Wolf went into production in late 1984, with the shoot wrapped in little more than 3 weeks. During filming, Fox agreed to replace Eric Stoltz in the role of Marty McFly in the new year, which meant that his upcoming schedule would become insane, starring in the next series of Family Ties and Back to the Future simultaneously, but his stardom would become equally ridiculous because of it. Atlantic Releasing initially planned to put Teen Wolf out in cinemas before the summer of '85, but as Back to the Future's production commenced and later test screenings for the Robert Zemeckis movie were coming back incredibly strong, they pivoted their schedule to maximise the reciprocal impact of this potential monster hit. It was agreed that Teen Wolf would instead drop more than a month after Back to the Future, which you have to acknowledge is a pretty genius bit of business. In the end, Teen Wolf was released in North America on August 23, 1985, meaning that it would not only be jumping on board the Fox hype train, but also still potentially be in cinemas for Halloween. Critical responses to the movie were a tad scary. Most reviews at the time didn't like it much, even though Fox was generally acknowledged as an engaging lead. Assessments range from the script and the direction are simply too lazy, to innocuous and well-intentioned, but terribly feeble, and determinedly bland and unoriginal, to another example of a decent idea yielding the least imaginative results conceivable. As the New York Times review summed it up, for a film that's so innocuous, Teen Wolf is aggressively boring. The thing is though, even if critics had considerable power still at the time, that power was dwarfed by the value of Michael J. Fox in the summer of '85. Teen Wolf's box office takings exceeded its budget in the first weekend of release, when it raked in over $6 million to finish in second place on the charts to Back to the Future, of course. The Fox 1-2 placing remained for 4 weeks in total, as Teen Wolf surfed the wave of momentum. In the end, the film stayed in US cinemas until December, and as it was released in countries across the globe over the coming months, that momentum remained. This small teen werewolf movie ended up grossing over $80 million in worldwide cinemas. Even if it did shamelessly piggyback off Back to the Future in some markets, such as in Brazil, where it was given the subtitle of O Garoto do Futuro, which translates as Boy of the Future, despite the fact that the film featured absolutely 0 instances of time travel.
Teen Wolf, O Garoto do Futuro.
Shameless? Sure, but the results were undeniable. No sense in fighting against the power of momentum, I guess. Fox later accepted that he had underestimated the cultural impact Teen Wolf could have. I was shocked that it was as big as it was. I thought it would just come and go, but people loved it. Teen Wolf isn't some earth-shattering masterpiece or a major artistic statement, but I think, as I often do when reflecting on reviews from the time, that the critics were harsh. Whether nostalgia driven or not, I'm a big fan. It's just so watchable and is an early, easygoing demonstration of how good a movie star Michael J. Fox would become. It's ridiculous, charming, well cast and acted, has a light satirical take on the vanity of fame, a moral lesson about understanding what really matters in life, and it's all wrapped up in a neat 92-minute package.
Oh, I see. Then everything is wrapped up in a neat little package. Really, I mean that. Sorry if it sounded sarcastic.
I mean, Fox's best mate in the movie, Rupert Stiles, is so cool that, in 2008, he inspired an American footballer called Greg White to change his legal name to Styles G. White. So, yeah, there's that. Really, what's not to like about Teen Wolf? It wouldn't have been as big a hit without its newly minted lead actor, but I'm glad it became one. Movies like this don't seem to make it to cinemas much anymore, and I wish they did. Not only was Teen Wolf a comparative smash on the big screen, but Atlantic were quick to further capitalise by getting the thing out on video just a few months later, continuing to push the value of Fox's other 1985 starring appearance. The movie was able to ride the mid to late 80s VHS boom for years to come in a considerable second wave.
Teen Wolf, a new comedy with Michael J. Fox, star of Back to the Future.
So much so, in fact, that not long after its release, it was clear that Teen Wolf would become a franchise opportunity. Not only was a cartoon TV series in the works, but a sequel film had also been given the green light, with, or more likely without, Michael J. Fox on board. Hi boss, yep, no need for the Halloween effects now. Thanks boss, yeah, I think the episode's going pretty well so far. Any notes? Right, yeah, okay. So you want a bit more spookiness for the Halloween crew watching this video in October? No problem at all. How about an 80s, 90s and 2000s Halloween and Halloween adjacent movie montage? Everybody loves a montage. Great, consider it done, boss. Hi boss. Yes, of course, I won't forget to remind people watching that if they like this sort of thing, they can subscribe to the channel to keep up to date with everything coming over the next year and beyond from Culture Slice. But for now, let's get back to the story of Teen Wolf and explore if the franchise dreams of the film's backers could actually become a reality. By early 1986, as Back to the Future became a bigger and bigger hit all across the globe, it became increasingly clear that Michael J. Fox would not be prioritizing a Teen Wolf sequel as part of his slate for the rest of the decade. Maintaining his role in Family Ties up until 1989, it wouldn't be long before he was also cast in not only star vehicles like The Secret of My Success, but also more serious fare, such as Brian De Palma's Casualties of War. There was of course also the inevitable Back to the Future 2 on the horizon, and with Part 1 netting over $300 million in cinemas, that was one of the biggest movies Hollywood could produce. The werewolf comedy sequel just couldn't compete. But Teen Wolf did have brand building in its sights, so a sequel would be greenlit without its star. It wasn't just a follow-up film on the way though. An animated TV series arrived in 1986. Obviously Michael J. Fox didn't return for it, but neither did almost all of the rest of the cast. It ran for 2 seasons, at a time when cartoon spin-offs from movies were becoming absolutely in vogue, and I remember quite enjoying it as a kid. It seems like the general consensus nowadays is that it was pretty good too. The direct Teen Wolf sequel we did get went into production at Atlantic on uncertain ground. Original director Rod Daniel has stated that he wasn't asked to return, but given he had some cachet in Hollywood now, you get the feeling that he still would have elected to move on regardless. He ended up making the body swap comedy Like Father Like Son, starring Kirk Cameron and Dudley Moore, which would make $34 million at the box office in the autumn of 1987. Atlantic releasing, the studio behind Teen Wolf was starting to creak under the strain of financial troubles despite their 1985 surprise hit, which would end up impacting the marketing rollout for Teen Wolf 2. With their lead star and director gone, along with the original screenwriters Loeb and Wiseman, who were, by this point, delivering the stories for films like Commando, Teen Wolf 2 soon became a sequel starting almost completely from scratch. The man who would fill the director's chair for Part 2, or Part 2, would be Christopher Leach. Largely working in TV in the 80s, making episodes of the likes of Moonlighting and Alfred Hitchcock Presents, he had made a couple of movies in the late 70s, the blaxploitation flick The Hitter, and the Telly Savalas action movie Border Cop. So it was a somewhat random choice for a teen werewolf sequel, but we were where we were by this point. Also moving over from TV was screenwriter Tim Kring, credited as R. Timothy Kring, who had got his start writing episodes of shows like Knight Rider, but this was his first film script. If Teen Wolf 2 could become a hit, then this was the ticket both needed to make Hollywood movies full time. Clearly, the replacement of the lead actor was going to be key here. Michael J. Fox had carried the first part to success, so they cast a type, choosing Jason Bateman to play the part of Todd, the cousin of Michael J. Fox's character. Bateman, like Fox, was an 80s teen idol thanks to his work on TV sitcoms. I mean, Bateman's sister Justine was starring with Fox in Family Ties. Synergy or what? So there was a logic there, but also the sense that they were attempting to capture lightning in a bottle for a second time. But Bateman hadn't made a film before, and he also didn't have a Back to the Future coming up on the release schedule. Teen Wolf 2 was produced by Kent Bateman. Wait, Bateman? No wonder he got the job. Kent is Jason's dad. Anyway, given that this was a new story and a clean slate, very few cast members returned the second time around. There was James Hampton as Todd's Uncle Howard, the father of Michael J. Fox in Part 1, and Mark Holton's Chubby, a pretty fun addition to the first movie who works fine here. Though, spoiler alert, they have weaker material to work with. As Teen Wolf 2 unfolds, you realise just how closely it follows the template of its predecessor. It is, in many ways, essentially the same film. Bateman's Todd is a university student this time who has been accepted on a scholarship. He isn't cool or sporty, but Coach Finstock, the basketball coach character from the first film, who is now working at the university, training boxers, and is played by a completely different actor, with Jay Tarsis being replaced by Paul Sand, hopes that the family werewolf gene Todd brings with him will improve his cratering boxing team. So it's basketball last time, boxing this time. Todd just wants to be a vet really, but Coach Finstock is getting pressured for success by John Astin's dean of the university. Todd has a Wolf Up episode at a uni event, becomes a massive outcast, but then it happens again at just the right time to win his first boxing match by knockout. Todd is suddenly the man. Wolf fever hits just as it had done for Scott in Part 1, and Todd falls into the same trappings, despite the fact that Nikki, played by Estee Chandler, is seemingly the perfect girl for him. Can Todd realise what's truly important in life, and can he lead his team to the championship, even if it's without his werewolf alter ego? This all sounds very familiar. Some details differ, but the arc is the same, the outcome is the same. Bateman's character's best friend is also Styles, but this time he's played by Stuart Fratkin. There's a popular girl, Beth Ann Miller, that Todd fancies, who has another meathead boyfriend, played by Robert Neary, that he also ends up facing in the climactic sporting event. There's even a moral lesson scene from Scott's dad. I mean, I've watched a lot of sequels in my time, but this does seem like excessive crossover, even for 80s Hollywood. Teen Wolf 2 went into production in early 1987, just as Bateman's star was rising thanks to his new show, The Hogan Family. Similarly budgeted to Part 1, Atlantic Releasing was pinning all its hopes on another hit when it rolled out in North American cinemas on November 20th, 1987. Critical reviews signaled trouble ahead. Analysis cited a relentlessly idiotic sequel with remote direction, witless dialogue, and charmless characters.
The problem with Teen Wolf 2 is that it's just an overstuffed gimmick film. The teachers who want him to win the boxing title compete with time for the love story. It's just not a good film.
It's a lousy film. In fact, I know why they had it as why he was a boxer. That's because you need to hire fewer extras to be in the crowd than if he were a football player.
Dave Kerr in the Chicago Tribune concluded that what was instinctive in the original has become self-conscious and calculated in the follow-up, and the spirit is gone. That spirit was even further gone when the box office numbers started coming in, opening in 6th place to roughly half the box office of the first Teen Wolf. The movie slinked out of the top 10 after one more week and was gone from theatres by early December. Seriously, they should have released this thing before Halloween, not just for the potential tie-in, but could you not have also thought about a random YouTube video in almost 40 years' time when you decided to release this after Halloween? Anyway, let's not beat around the bush here. Teen Wolf 2 is a bad film. I'm not sure it'll rank that highly in the eventual Sequelpalooza worst sequels of all time, but that episode is probably years away from happening anyway, and Lord only knows what crimes against cinema we'll have covered by that point. It's not aggressively nasty or in your face, but it's all a bit awkward and rubbish. The best part of the movie is probably the romance between Todd and Nikki, but that is lost in a sludge of unfunny jokes and uncomfortable nonsense and feels like it's from a completely different movie. Some of the cast have mentioned that there were earlier versions with more jokes and less copy and pasting from the first movie, but in the end, what we got has absolutely no reason to exist when it essentially traces over the work of the first film, colours it all in a slightly different shade, and then presents it in a far less appealing sum of parts. Atlantic Releasing struggled to replicate the marketing push of Part 1, but even if they'd have had a bigger budget, this was always unlikely to go anywhere. It found a second life on video and cable TV, largely thanks to the popularity of the first movie, and has been packaged up as a double feature with its much more liked precursor, but it has been categorised as a card-carrying member of the sequel Hall of Shame. It's very obvious why it didn't resonate with audiences upon release. In more recent years, Jason Bateman has been reflective about the disaster zone that was Teen Wolf 2. There's so many things that made that probably me included. That was a real stinker. I mean, come on, you could smell that one from a mile away. Really, the cleverest thing about the sequel is its title. Using 2, as in T-O-O, rather than the number 2, is the kind of play on words that does fill my cold heart with a little joy. It's not nearly enough to save this movie, of course, and it's hardly something Shakespeare would be proud of, but it's a very small partial credit on an otherwise disastrous undertaking. And when that's one of the highlights, you're definitely howling at the moon by that point.
If you had had proper management as a kid, I would imagine you'd have a lot more money saved.
Right.
Your affairs would have been handled differently. Planning would have been involved.
I would not have done Teen Wolf 2.
Thank you, and welcome to another episode of Did You Know? On today's show, the story of the female-led Teen Wolf films we didn't get to see. Did you know that not one but two gender-swapped Teen Wolf follow-up movies could have surfaced in the late 1980s? Firstly, we missed out on another direct Teen Wolf film, with the plan being for young 80s teen idol Alyssa Milano to step into the shoes of Michael J. Fox and star as a female football-playing werewolf. In fact, both the Scott and Todd characters were set to join the young Who's the Boss star in the prequel of the series. No word on if Fox and Bateman were tapped up to return, but for vastly differing reasons, I'd say that was unlikely to happen on both counts. I mean, I guess this concept could have worked out alright, but we'll never know either way, as the movie didn't get beyond the initial planning stage. Secondly, comes a film which actually did get made, but one that strayed fairly far from the Teen Wolf template. Rather than a direct sequel, Teen Witch was initially conceived as a gender-swapped rip-off of Teen Wolf from a pitch delivered within the film's production team. That idea ended up being developed into a very different, separate movie for another studio, one full of musical numbers and serious fashion choices, which would eventually be released in 1989 to basically no box office and scathing reviews. Teen Witch has, however, gone on to gain a cult status amongst fans. We didn't get either concept as originally planned back then, but if you ask fans of Teen Witch, they'll tell you that what we did get was one of the best movies ever, one that taps into being a teenager in a way few other films come close to. Others now see it as so bad that it actually somehow becomes good, while TV Guide's review at the time noted that one keeps waiting for something interesting to happen in Teen Witch, but it never does. It's certainly one of the most 80s movies ever, but I'll leave it up to you to decide whether that is a really good thing or a really, really bad one. Well, that's all we've got time for today. Join us next time on Did You Know? In the 1980s, Hollywood had a general rule of thumb when it came to sequels. If the second one earned 75% of the returns delivered by the original film, then it would be considered a success. Clearly, Teen Wolf 2 didn't achieve that financially, but if we're being charitable, then creatively, it got to maybe 25% of the first movie. Teen Wolf isn't a laugh riot or anything, but it is genuinely funny at times, and you root for the protagonist. That doesn't end up really being the case as much in the sequel. Teen Wolf 2's comedy is forced and rarely, if ever, lands at all. The character development is also minimal in part 2. Feels like the first film covered a fairly large amount of ground, but there is little of that the second time around. The direction and pacing are pedestrian at best in the follow-up as well. If Teen Wolf 2 had attempted to present a new angle, maybe given the sequel a more edgy, cooler aesthetic, with its lead teetering on the line between hero and villain, it could have sustained a level of intrigue which just wasn't there with the movie that we got. Instead, they went the route of plagiarizing what had worked before and ended up being left in the lurch at the crazy golf course. Or something. The soundtrack for the first film is, I would say, an underrated 80s hidden gem. Miles Goodman, a really underappreciated composer, provides some legitimately fantastic synth-led numbers for the score, and other bangers like James House's Flesh on Fire made it a winner all around. It's topped off by the iconic Win in the End by Mark Saffin, which gets you far more pumped for the climactic basketball match than you have any right to be, and wouldn't be out of place in any 80s film you could name. Although the music in part 2 doesn't quite compare, it is probably one of the most interesting things about the film. Speaking of music, the party scene in Teen Wolf 2, even if there is a slight strange sense of nostalgic fun in it, encapsulates the random awkwardness of so much of the movie. And when exactly did Todd and his dancers have the time to learn all this choreography? Rod Daniel, director of the original Teen Wolf, would end up seeing that first movie as the high watermark of his film career. Going on to direct the Jim Belushi and Jerry the Dog buddy cop film K-9, and the Joe Pesci commercial and critical disaster The Super, he would eventually find himself in his own Sequelpalooza, making both Beethoven's Second and Home Alone 4 before quitting the industry, though he did avoid making the K-9 sequels K-911 and K-9PI. And yes, these are real movies, and yes, they aren't nearly as enjoyable as the original.
I don't want to have to mount you.
Teen Wolf was the one movie he would truly cherish until his passing in 2016. His views on the film not long after its release remained true for the rest of his life. I'm so proud of Teen Wolf. It was a chance for me to start over. It really was a well-written script. It makes a little statement. It's a clean, classy little movie. In the roll call of bad sequels, one of the most often recurring underlying issues is that replacing your lead actor is a supremely risky move, and I'm not sure there are many better examples of this than Teen Wolf 2. It's a prime case of Hollywood's obsession with creating a sequel at all costs, a trend driven by the increasing influence of large corporations and Wall Street in the film industry at the time. Without Michael J. Fox or any sort of genuine idea to move the story on, what we're left with is a far inferior retread that follows the narrative of Part 1 far too closely. The original Teen Wolf really shouldn't have worked as well as it did. The story is throwaway, the wolf makeup is a bit ridiculous, and the script and direction aren't mind-blowing, but it still somehow works. I guess that somehow is the undefinable difference that a well-matched star can bring to a finished movie. Months prior to the release of Teen Wolf 2, Michael J. Fox continued to reiterate his star power with another comedy film, 1987's The Secret of My Success, which he headlined to 5 consecutive weeks at the top of the North American box office and over $111 million worldwide, despite less than glowing reviews. The contrast with Teen Wolf 2 could not have been more stark, sadly.
You know what's funny? I wanted you to become the wolf more than anybody else. So I guess I'm partly to blame for what you've become.
What have I become?
A jerk, Todd.
Jason Bateman is clearly a massively talented actor, both comedic and serious, as his considerable resume has ably demonstrated. Teen Wolf 2, however, was the wrong job at the wrong time for him, and it probably came too early. It's just one of those things, I guess. There is a question around how wrong it really went for Teen Wolf as a franchise in the longer term. MTV brought the story of Teen Wolf back with a darker, dramatic, supernatural tone in 2011, and that ran for 6 seasons and spawned a spin-off film for Paramount Plus in 2023. I'd wager that this isn't the last we'll see of Teen Wolf as a concept either. It taps into a sense of being different in the formative years of your life that is pretty universal. So money has certainly been made along the way. Someone has made a killing from Teen Wolf over the decades. Whether through luck or circumstance, the original Teen Wolf managed to book one of the most iconic movie stars of the 80s just prior to them blowing up. The timing could not have been better, and the success it drove for the film instigated one of the most unnecessary sequels ever made. In the words of its own headliner, you could smell that one from a mile away. It's a shame the sequel couldn't shapeshift into a film you could really sink your teeth into. Hi boss. Great, thank you. Yeah, the episode's all done now. Looking forward to clocking off for the weekend. Any plans? Sorry, what's that? It's time to start work on the Christmas episode?
Merry Christmas, you filthy animal.
So there we have it, the Sequelpalooza story so far. If you've made it over 2 hours into this video, I just wanted to say thank you for choosing to spend your precious time with Culture Slice. There's a huge amount to come from the channel over the next year and beyond, so please do subscribe if you like this kind of thing. It is hugely appreciated. And with that, good night, thank you, and of course, save Ferris.